Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Nature of the Problem of Domestic Violence in Tribal Communities in California. Thank you all for joining us today, and before we get started, I will walk us through some tech-related housekeeping notes. First, you should see the viewer window where the PowerPoint is displayed, and on the right side is your control panel. It can sometimes minimize itself, so look for a small orange arrow that will open your control panel if you do not see it. On the control panel is where you will find your audio controls. You can view, select, and test your audio here. If you would like to join via telephone, click the Use Telephone and it will display your audio, dial in information, and audio PIN. All attendees will be muted during the presentation portion of the webinar today. Please use the question box to type in any questions throughout the webinar. We will be monitoring it as we go, but all the questions will be saved until the end during the Q&A session. During the Q&A portion, you will also be able to use the raise your hand function. It is an icon of a hand with an arrow pointing up. This will allow us to unmute your line and you can ask your questions live. We do have just one handout for you today, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides under handouts in your control panel. You will receive a survey at the end of today's webinar and in your follow-up email. We ask you to please complete the survey about the webinar. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. And finally, a quick reminder that today's webinar is being recorded. So again, thank you all for joining us today and welcome to today's webinar, Nature of the Problem of Domestic Violence in Tribal Communities in California. This webinar is presented by Bonnie Claremont, Victim Advocacy Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and I will turn it over to Bonnie to get us started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar. As Abby said, I am the Victim Advocacy Specialist here at the Institute. I'm based out of St. Paul, Minnesota, and opened an office here about 17 years ago. Prior to coming to the Institute, I served as an advocate for probably about 25 years or so. I'm a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation. My tribe is located in Wisconsin, and I live here and based here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And forward. So I want to provide a little bit of an overview of today's presentation. I think if we look at any one of these crimes, we could spend a whole webinar, of course, on any one, but I was asked to sort of touch on each of these different crime areas: the domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking as it occurs in Indian country. And also to look at how these crimes may intersect and the impact of these crimes and the needs of victims of these crimes. And also look at how we can work more collaboratively across jurisdictional boundaries, and then also some of the challenges of prosecuting these crimes. Next slide. So I always like to start on a positive note. And I really believe, based on our stories, what our elders have taught us, what our elders have told us, that the problem of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, sex trafficking wasn't always a problem as it is today. In fact, it didn't exist. And and I base this on some of these points that I have here, but also just a lot more in terms of the history as it's been told, because a lot of our history is oral. We had strong traditional customs values where women were viewed as sacred, and as life givers, we bring forth life and future generations for our nations. So because of that, women were protected versus being abused or violated, that they were protected physically, emotionally, and so forth. Our tribal nations had a system in place to address any acts of violence as it occurred. And violence against women and children were considered a really egregious crimes because, again, because women were sacred, children were considered sacred because they're the future of our nations and had to be protected. So it was really believed that the stronger the women, the stronger the children, the stronger the nations today and in the future. So such acts were addressed swiftly and appropriately. We had our own traditional forms of consequences that were imposed, and some of them were pretty harsh because of the egregiousness of the crime. There were no words for rape in tribal languages, and I've kind of through the years as I've traveled across Indian country have, asked tribes, do you have a word for rape in your language? And the answer is by and large no. And if they do have, it's not really a word, it's sort of a sentence describing the act of rape. So there's my conclusion that if we didn't have a word for it, it didn't exist. Children were seen as a gift from the creator. Mother-child bond was very sacred and protected. And, I say this because today, as we see, and I'll talk about that later, but underreporting happens because a lot of victims of violence are women. And a lot of the women that are abused, are victims of crime, don't want to report because they fear their children will be taken. And there is history of that where our children are removed from us, are taken from us. So um, and also the violence as it occurred in tribal nations was addressed collectively. And oftentimes today we call that a coordinated community response or a multidisciplinary team. That kind of a response, it really happened in our tribal nations. So it's not a new thing. So when I talk to tribes about, responses, I talk about, coming together collectively to address those crimes. And that way there's less likely a chance of gaps in the system. So, and I'll be talking more about that as well in this webinar. Forward. So again, like I said, we could spend a whole webinar on just talking about domestic violence. So a good place to start is just asking, the question, what is it? And of course, you all have your state laws, state codes, right? So again, it's defined there, as well as tribes have their laws, and they have their definitions, which often, sort of mimic state federal laws. So, as we've done a lot of work with tribes who are developing their DV codes, we really encourage that they incorporate their own traditional language in their codes. And I've seen that happen, and it's pretty amazing to see tribes use their own their languages within their codes. But advocates, I think, we have our own definition. And like I said, I worked for many years as an advocate, and it really helps to have one that people really can understand, because oftentimes victims will come to us when they've been raped or when they've been victimized by one of these crimes and say, something happened to me last night and I'm not sure if it is sexual assault, if it is domestic violence. And, so they're looking for probably a legal definition, but they're also looking to have what happened to them validated, because they have, a certain reaction to what happened to them. They're not feeling well. They're feeling bad about the situation. So the advocate's working definition is domestic violence occurs when an abusive partner, and it could be in any gender, uses a repetitive pattern. So there's sort of some things that have led up to this ultimate violation, this abuse that happened, to cause the victim to reach out and ask. So it's not just sort of a one-time thing out of the blue and then this person, the victim, is disclosing. There's generally a pattern, a history of the abusive behavior. to maintain power over another person and control their actions. So we'll talk more about how power and control is the primary motive. But this is a definition that we've used in lots of tribal communities. And this one came from the Strong-Hearted Native Women's Coalition, which is a coalition based in California. Next slide. And also with sexual assault and stalking, again, it's important to review, of course, your own state definitions, but also tribal definitions to really refer back those working in the community to what's written in their own laws, if they have. And up until a few years ago, some of the laws in these in tribal codes were a little outdated, so tribes have been working really hard in updating their laws. And so the sexual assault refers to sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the victim. Consent is always such a huge factor. If the victim doesn't say anything, is it still consent, right? And we say that all the time. The key word is explicit. The consent has to be explicit. And these are some of the different forms of sexual assault that fit under the definition. Stalking is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And we'll see stalking often in cases of domestic violence. Once the victim reports, that's when things become really a lot more volatile for a victim, because this person, the batterer, is losing control. And remember when I said the primary motive being for power and control, if the victim escapes, if the victim leaves, the victim reports, it increases the chances of it becoming more volatile, right? Oftentimes what will end up happening then is the batterer will stalk the victim at their place of employment, which will cause problems for the victim, right? Because an employer probably doesn't want to have that kind of trouble in the workplace, and may pose some consequences for the victim because of what the batterer is doing, and ultimately the victim could lose his or her job over it. So again, there may be issues there related to legal issues, or whether or not she's going to be able to get her unemployment, for example. So no single legal definition exists. Stalking varies widely in statute definition and also in tribal codes, in the scope of it and the crime classification and associated penalties. Next slide. So what is sex trafficking? Again, state definitions, and more tribes are developing sex trafficking codes, which I think is awesome. And because they're seeing more cases of it, whether it's anecdotally or actually reported cases, we always tell, as I travel across Indian country, I really encourage people to assume that it's happening, because more than likely it is. And if proactively, if you put some responses in place and awareness, community awareness, you'll start to see more victims being able to reach out for some help. Advocates' working definition: sex trafficking is the sexual exploitation of another person for personal and/or commercial gain, often referred to as modern day slavery. And we put it in that context because it really is. It's about ownership, someone owning a person and controlling their every move, who they talk to, how much money they have to make, and not even being in control of the money that they bring to the trafficker. This crime usually includes the trafficker exercising power and control. We see it again as the motive over the victim. Victims may not be free to come and go as they choose. And we have to see one of these: force, fraud, or coercion, if the victim is older than 18 or older. Okay. But under the age of 18, there's no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Next slide. So I wanted to say also backing up, when we look at the crime of sex trafficking, yes, sexual assault can happen within the crime of sex trafficking because, if we look at the definition of consent, right? If someone is unable to consent because there is force, fraud, or coercion, if there is if the trafficker is drugging the victim, if the victim is being drugged, they're not going to be able to consent. There are circumstances like that, but people assume that this person is engaged in prostitution that's consensual. But there's also those factors of the force, fraud, and coercion, and also because of that power and control, and also because they may not be able to, either because a physical condition or uh, because they're being forced. So I wanted to say that. So there's an intersection there, and we really encourage when these cases are being investigated, the possibility of other crimes happening along with the crime that was originally reported or that people are suspecting happened. So like if there's a sexual assault that's been reported, there's a chance there's other crimes that may have occurred as well, to not exclude the possibility. So we want to look at, well, how serious is the problem of sex trafficking in California, for example, because in California, California is one of the largest sites of human trafficking in the United States. And this data came from 2018. 1,656 cases of human trafficking were reported in California. Of those cases, 1,226 were sex trafficking cases. So, so California is the highest. And also, there are a lot of tribal communities in California, right? And there's also a lot of transiency, a lot of Native people moving in and out of their communities to urban areas also. And, it's difficult to say the actual data that's happening as far as, the number of Native people being trafficked. It's not reliable at this point. And there's more task forces that are springing up around the country. We just started one here in Minnesota, a Native task force on trafficking that started a couple of years ago, it was. And so what we have to go on is more anecdotal evidence. And if you talk to people in tribal communities, ask them, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to advocates, they're going to say, yes, definitely. We are working with X number of reported cases or cases that have been disclosed to us. But if you talk to someone else like law enforcement, they're going to say, well, we only seen maybe one or two last year. So it really depends on who you talk to, but if you talk to advocates, they're going to say, yes, the numbers are increasing all the time. I saw a figure recently, the National Congress of American Indians said that they estimated 40% of women who are victims of sex trafficking identify as American Indian, Alaska Native. So 40% is pretty high when we look at the population overall. So I also want to say about sex trafficking is the people that out there that are doing a lot of research on murdered, missing Indigenous women are looking at the correlation between the MMIW problem that has existed since time immemorial, and also the correlation between that and sex trafficking. That our people are missing. We call each other relatives because in a traditional context, we're all related, even related to, the animals and the wildlife out there because we're interdependent upon each other. So, I encourage people to refer to one another as relatives. So when our relatives go missing, there's a really strong possibility that they're being trafficked, right? And then ultimately they could end up being murdered. So there is that strong correlation. So it's good to know that where research is being done on MMIW, they look at how does trafficking fit with that? So, and there's some work like that currently being done in California, Northern California. Okay, risk factors. Oh, where are we at? Back up. Yeah. Sex trafficking risk factors. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, excuse me, um, many have pointed to the overrepresentation of Native women in prostitution and the risk factors for trafficking that Native women and youth face, including prior sexual victimization, poverty, homelessness, as key indicators, right, of that the problem is significant. A lot of our Indian people, there's a high rate of sexual assault in our communities, and it's part of our history of historic trauma, where our children were taken and removed from homes and placed in government boarding schools, and where we believe that cycle of violence, of sexual violence started. And, along with the victimization that's impacting victims today, they also have that, the historic trauma, the intergenerational trauma that also needs to be addressed and taken into consideration. And also poverty. We still have poverty rates that are really high in tribal communities, and homelessness. And that exists everywhere, particularly in a lot of the urban communities. You'll see communities of homelessness. And also I want to mention, people that identify as LGBTQ also are placed in that risk category, only because they are so marginalized, so oppressed. A lot of hate crimes that also impact our relatives that identify as LGBTQ. So when we look at Native youth, these are all risk factors especially for our children as well, our adolescents and our youth. They also can be homeless, couch hopping. So these are all risk factors for Native people. Next slide. So we have to ask why. And we come from a culture, a history where we have really strong cultural traditions. It's like, why are these happening? Next slide. So I've already mentioned, boarding schools, that history of boarding schools, and as a whole, the cultural oppression. Boarding schools where our children were punished for speaking their language. They couldn't practice their own traditional ways of spirituality. And also the diminishment in the status of women. A lot of our tribal nations were matrilineal, matriarchal, and those changed along with the colonization, and where our gender roles were much more equal, much more egalitarian in nature, and that's changed also. There's sort of the shift in power has changed, where there's no longer that equalness between genders. And Native women are also in a lot of ways, whether it's media, advertising, are often sexually objectified. And if you objectify something, it no longer becomes a human being. It becomes an object, and it's easy then to exploit, abuse, and harm an object. And often I'll say that we're viewed as disposable commodities, especially when you look at sex trafficking, where it's so it's really for monetary gain, right? And then we become a commodity that you can sell, you can buy and sell. We also, when the boarding school movement happened, and it continued until just recent years. It broke down a lot of our kinship system. We have a strong kinship system where, we, based on what clan you belong to, based on your role, that determines your role in your tribe as your clan and your kinship. And that was also broken down as a result of boarding schools, and also the jurisdictional problem that we have, perpetrators coming onto tribal lands where tribes lack jurisdictional authority, like, even in PL 280 states, which is California. um, we can't hold perpetrators that come onto our tribal land accountable for the crimes they commit. It's gradually changing with federal legislation, but for crimes like sexual assault, we still do not have full jurisdiction over those that commit major crimes, the non-native that commit crimes on tribal lands like sexual assault crimes. And um, and it's also difficult because a lot of our tribes still are um, under-resourced. A lot of our tribes in California, for example, are located in very remote, isolated areas. I remember visiting a tribe and we had to sort of drive up this little mountain, and they were way up there, little small tribe. And yet, as small as they were still addressing these issues of domestic violence within their little community. They had a little tribal office that looked like a double wide trailer. And yet they were doing some really incredible work, just creating that kind of awareness in their community around domestic violence. Um, and it's difficult, especially in PL 280. I could sit and talk about the problems, the challenges of living in a PL 280 state. Minnesota is a PL 280 state. You have to rely on your local police departments, your local county sheriff's office, for example. And in a lot of locations here in Minnesota, for example, there's still that sort of small town mentality. And if you aren't living within that community in town there, you're sort of this isolated community out here, a tribal reservation. It's sort of like you don't belong, and you still are there at their whim if they can help you, because often these sheriff's departments, small town police department, are also very under resourced, right? Along with some of their own biases. They may have not had adequate training around domestic violence response and have their own judgment about why someone is being abused. And especially if they're called to that location, if the tribe doesn't have their own tribal police, for example, it becomes really difficult, really, to be able to bring together those responders into a more coordinated community response, as they see this tribe not being really a part of their community, right? That they should be able to do for themselves. So it's difficult in those ways for people that live in the tribes that are in PL 280 states. Next slide. So the data, sexual violence, 56.1% of American Indian Alaska women have experienced sexual violence. 66.4% have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. 55.5% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. And also, when we look at stalking, 24.5% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced stalking in their lifetime. I always say when I look at these statistics, it's like, as Native women, we are the most often raped, the most often battered, the most often physically assaulted, the most often stalked. And when we look at all the challenges that are still there for reporting, for obtaining and receiving good, victim-centered, culturally appropriate services, receiving legal help, legal assistance, because it's costly for a lot of Native women. And like I said, we still have conditions of poverty. We have, Native women, Native battered women who lose their jobs because of the stalking, like I mentioned earlier, of their batterer, by their batterer. So when you put that all together, it creates a situation where these statistics are so high and yet the resources just don't meet the need and the demand. Next slide. The question, I think, for me begs to be asked, why do batterers batter? When we look at why are these rates so high? It's like, where does this come from? It's coming from the people who are perpetrating these crimes, right? So even when we talk about prevention, I have, as an advocate, right, I really have issues with the word prevention, because right away, what enters a person's mind when we talk about prevention of sexual assault? To think about that for a minute. What comes to mind when we start saying we're going to do prevention work on sexual assault? It has more to do with the onus of that falls on the shoulders of victims, right? That if they walk in well-lit areas, if they walk with someone, if they don't drink with people they don't know, or go home with someone they don't know well, that's going to prevent sexual violence from occurring, right? And then we look at domestic violence. How do we prevent domestic violence, right? And oftentimes the responsibility gets placed on the victim's shoulders. Well, don't get him mad, or don't provoke it, or don't do something that that he's going to get angry about, right? So I just have to say that. So we have to ask the question, if it's because of the perpetrators, perpetrating these crimes, that how do we hold them accountable? How do we create that offender accountability? Next slide. So I want to talk briefly about this power and control wheel. And you probably have seen this. This was created out of Duluth, Minnesota, and it's called the Duluth model. And it's been around for forever, since probably the 80s. And I also want to say, before I go on too much further, if you have any questions, comments, please, I just want to remind you, put them in your chat box there, and at the end I'll be able to respond to some questions. The power and control wheel, as you see in the center, it says power and control, and that's the primary motive. That's the hub of this wheel. That's at the center, right? And also I want to say that these crimes, for me, I always call them externally imposed, because oftentimes you'll have batterers who will say, she's crazy, she's out of her mind, she doesn't know what she's talking about, she's making it all up, it's all in her mind, she's mentally ill, she's on this drug, she's on that drug. So no, she's making all that up, right? So, and then when someone is being told over and over, you're no good, you're not a good mother, you're not a good partner, you're not good, sexually, you're not good for any, you can't keep the house clean, you can't make the kids behave, you're this, you're that, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too this. After a while, that really can impact a woman's mental, cognitive ability, her thinking, her decision making, even, where that person starts to feel like they are crazy, right? That they have some mental illness. And then oftentimes they'll get referred to therapy or counseling, or even a woman who's been raped, right? They'll refer someone like that off to behavioral health within Indian Health Service clinic, for example. When I say the problem is much more externally imposed, there's a culture of violence out there. I always call it a rape culture when we talk about sexual assault, that it's permission giving based on what we see in the media, what we see in advertising. And our children out at a really young ages pick up those cues, those messages, that it's really okay to make fun of girls, for boys to make fun of girls, for example. So for me, I call it, those are all externally imposed reasons why these kinds of crimes happen. It starts from there, right? And so it's important we look at response to victims, that we're not putting a label of mental illness on the needs of victims, the impact of victims, because we have to take into account the tactics that batterers use, right? So the spokes of this wheel indicate those tactics: the emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty, right? Um, for example, if someone is cheating, if a batterer is cheating, that batterer may not come back from work, right? May make excuses, and if the battered woman asks, well, where have you been, or what, right now he'll say, there you go again, creating these things in your head, I've been working and I pay for all this that you enjoy every day, and you're accusing me. That kind of thing, that gaslighting, right? She starts to think she's crazy and is sort of conjuring these things up. Using isolation, batterers will keep the victim from having contact with her relatives, her friends, where she can get support, where she can be empowered, right? Anytime a victim is empowered, it really then makes it more difficult for that batterer to control the victim, right? Because she's starting to see that this isn't right. Other people are saying you deserve better. That shouldn't be happening to you. That you don't deserve that. So he uses isolation as a way then to be able to exert that power and control. Um, and we'll see the same exact things as I'm talking about here in situations of trafficking. A trafficker will use these same tactics. So again, that intersectionality is really important to look at. Limiting her outside involvement, um, even in terms of seeking medical attention for victims of sex trafficking. The trafficker will keep the victim from even seeking medical attention for, an STI maybe that she's contracted, right? If the trafficker does allow the victim to see a doctor or seek medical attention, the trafficker will go with and monitor the victim. So oftentimes we say, be aware of other people that the victim is with, that person may be there only to monitor what she says, how much information she divulges. And even to the extent that a trafficker will have like a script. He'll say, if you're ever questioned, if anyone ever asks you, this is what you say. And he'll have the victim even tell him what she's going to say and practice that over and over. Using jealousy to justify actions. I just don't want you looking at anyone else because you're all mine, and that makes me upset when you look at anyone else. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Like I said, making her feel like she's at fault. She's, that anything that's going wrong is really her fault, or really negating what she says when that hurt, you hurt me when you said that, that, well, that's all in your head, you're confusing things. Using children is a huge one for batterers. Using children, making her feel guilty, saying, well, you smoked that pot too, so if you call the police, I'm going to tell them you're here smoking weed, you're using drugs. um, so she begins to think that, if I leave him, I'll lose the children because he's threatened that. Using male privilege. I also want to say that in tribal communities, there's a lot of politics at play, right? Where a batter can have relatives who are in tribal leadership positions, or a batter may have a relative who works for the police department. And it becomes difficult because, just like in rural communities, the communities are fairly small. Even if the tribe is large, communities are fairly small, where everyone knows everyone is related to everyone. So makes it even more challenging for victims to disclose and report, reach out for help. Use male privilege, really believes like, I get to do this because I can. being that master of the castle, being the one to define men's and women's roles. That, you know, I'm here to do this. I bring in the money. It's your role to keep the house and make the children behave. Using economic abuse. Batterers control the finances. Again, another way to exert that power and control. Maybe only give her 20 bucks, 50 bucks a week, and keeps the rest. So, because if she has financial resources, she may have enough resources to leave him, right? So he controls all of that. Using coercion and threats, carrying out those threats. You know, for example, if he has weapons, even, you know, she knows he has a weapon, and again, she'll, you know, he'll use that as needed. Or he may threaten to, if she, you know, threatens to leave, that he's going to kill her, kill himself, kill the children. And we've heard those kind of incidents in the news. So these are all the tactics that are used. And again, like I said, there's a lot of crossover when we look at trafficking as it happens. I also want to say that batterers batter, they make a choice, just like rapists rape because they make a choice. There's only very few cases, right, where it's happening because there's, you know, a mental reason that that this perpetration is happening. Batterers batter. They choose to be violent. They choose to batter. It's a choice that they're making, a conscious choice. Next slide. There's still a lot of myths out there. It's just so important that we realize fully that batter's abuse is intentional. It's well orchestrated. You know, often we'll hear, well, he just inherited his dad's temper. You know, you just got to be careful. Or that old saying, boys will be boys. You know, it's not the result of uncontrollable rage or impulse. You know, batters choose the violence, and it doesn't come out of a disagreement. Oh, there they go. They're just squabbling. They go through that from time to time. They'll be all right. Um, but but yet the perpetrator carefully orchestrates which behaviors are acceptable, which behaviors are unacceptable, which behaviors outside of the scope of what the perp deems acceptable. The perp may use one or more of the tactics in the DV wheel, right? So it's a combination of things given the circumstance at the time. So again, it's very well orchestrated. And I really want to encourage when you're look at these cases to really look at the role that advocates play in these situations. That advocates are really helpful, not only to the victim but those who are working on these cases, because they have a good sense of what's going on in the community, where the victim support system is, even the sort of the tribal politics out there. So it's really important to work with advocates, and they also are very good at identifying where there is domestic violence. They're good at screening without creating that sort of discomfort with the victim. They're good at being able to sit down and develop that trusting relationship with that victim. And as you work any of these cases, you know, that's where we need victims to, you know, oftentimes, you know, if a victim says, I don't want to pursue this, I want to back out. You know, those that we're working with, investigators, prosecutors, get really upset with us as advocates, because they'll say, well, convince her to stay in there. We've done a lot of work on this case. But yet as advocates, you know, we really support the decisions that victims make. But if that victim gets a good response at first disclosure and has an advocate working with them, the chances of them moving forward through this case to the end is better, is greater. The chances are greater. So it's really important to involve advocates when you can. But it's really important, as you educate others, as education is done, to look at these myths and how they're perpetrated. I've had perps, you know, in a courtroom who even, you know, send me a glare because they know I'm the advocate. It's kind of like, I'll get you. I recognize that, even that for me is like power and control, right? Because I'm there for the victim and it's like, how dare you? So it's at play all the time, and all the more reason to keep those places safe for victims. And be aware of that, the nuances of how batterers do that. They're really good at it. Um, so I'm not going to go into detail, but these are some that, and I really encourage the use of educating about myths that still are used, are out there. Next slide. So impact. I have to say, it's going to vary based on how long the abuse occurred, how long it's been going on. I worked with a woman here as an advocate. The abuse started when her first one was born. She had 3 daughters. When the youngest one turned 18, she left the abuse, and that happened throughout the whole marriage. A very affluent family from one of the suburbs here in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was, I believe, a doctor or something. I can't remember. Very affluent family, and um, that went on for years. Probably a good, I would say, maybe 30, close to 30 years. The abuse went on, and the trauma that took on her, it ultimately took her life. And I say it's a whole person impact. It's not just a physical. And yet, when victims disclose, if they're communicating with us pretty clearly, they seem pretty coherent. You don't see any bruises on them, especially for a victim of sexual assault, for example. You don't see her bruised up, injured. There's some assumptions. Well, she seemed fine. I saw her in the emergency room and didn't see any injuries. It's really important for us to think about it as a whole person impact, and it may be impacting other parts of her life and her person. Um, some physical injuries, like I said, with sex trafficking, some may go untreated. The same with battered women. They may have broken bones that never were treated. um, Difficulty concentrating. Oftentimes we'll hear victims say, I feel crazy. It is crazy making when someone who on one hand says, I love you, I care for you, I can't live without you. At the same time, they're saying that, then the next moment they may be battering you or harming you. That can make someone feel really crazy. Um, Sleep deprived, for a lot of victims, if they've been assaulted while they're asleep or woken up and beaten, sleep's going to be very difficult for them. Partial amnesia, our minds have a way of shutting down because that helps us to deal with reality. And when our minds shut down, it creates some level of amnesia or forgetfulness, or because we want to block out some of those negative experiences, that trauma. Economic hurdles, I've already mentioned that. When your batterer, your trafficker controls the finances, it becomes really difficult to be able to afford the things that you need, even medication. Um, the needs that you have just for yourself and your children. If you've been fired from your job, right, you're not going to be able to afford those things. Fears, whether it's just general fear or fear of something specific. Fear of losing your children, loss of faith, just that sense of helplessness and hopelessness, where you also see elements of depression. I often say that, if someone has a history of depression and it's been sort of controlled with medication, um, probably that depression is going to be exacerbated with the trauma of violence. Eating disorders, if you're told you're too fat, you're this, you're too that, then it's going to affect someone's eating, or just the inability to eat because what's happened to you is pretty sickening and eating becomes difficult. Depression, drug addiction can also lead to suicidal ideation. Anger, I actually think anger is kind of an okay feeling to have. I always tell victims that I work with, if you're feeling anger about what happened to you, that's really an okay sign. It's what you do with the anger. And I help them as an advocate to help them, express their anger in a healthy way. May make frequent visits to the emergency room. There may be a history of that, and also the possibility of any sexually transmitted infections. This is a partial list. Again, it really depends on the severity of the violence, the duration, and also the person themselves, and how they respond. Some of us are really good at sort of going in automatic overdrive, even if we're hurting in any way, shape, or form. And that's the same with people who've been traumatized. They can still continue on. And it amazes me, if you're working with someone who's a victim of any of these crimes, how they are still able to parent, how they're able to still keep a job, still go to school. And, I always have to tell them, you're amazing. So it's really okay to do that if you're working with a victim of any of these crimes, to really remind them that they're doing a good job. Next slide. So I use this, I call it whole person impact. The line is the violation that happens, whether it's sexual, physical, emotional violation. I drew this one through the emotions part. And it can impact all parts of the body. It can impact, once it's impacted one part, it can impact the other parts of a person, right? So it's important just to keep this in mind. I always say that, the physical, for battered women, the physical can heal up. If it's a broken bone, you can have it set. Your physical injuries can heal up. It's so much more challenging to heal the emotional wounds because they go so deep, right? And they impact the other parts of that person who may have experienced prior victimization, because for a lot of us, we talk about that, historic trauma. We carry that trauma that our ancestors carried in our bones, is what I always say. And because of that, there's sort of layers of that trauma that's happened that can also get triggered with the trauma that happens today. So it's important to look at that in terms of how healing needs to happen then, right? Whether it's through Western healing methods, or whether it's a Native person's own traditional healing, because there are people who are really good at that. And I really recommend, if a Native woman, for example, wants to do some healing work, to work with another Native woman, just because it just is, for me, a lot safer environment for women to work with women. But it's easy for us to sort of minimize the trauma if we don't see the physical bruises. Okay, next slide. So I want to just say one more thing about this is called a medicine wheel. What I just showed you, the 4 colors. The number 4 is a really sacred number for us, and also the colors within this wheel all represent different things in our culture. You want to back up, Abby? It represents the 4 directions. It represents, 4 seasons. There's a lot of different representations along with using the medicine wheel. And what was I going to say about this? Oh, when we look at healing, when I do training with advocates, I always say, look at, not just a physical, but also, what kind of resources does a victim of trauma, whether it's sexual assault, stalking, domestic violence, sex trafficking, chances are it's impacted them in all of these areas. They're going to need some resources to heal in all of these areas. So look at what are the resources within your community, outside of your community, and be aware of those resources. How can you help them heal physically, right? They may need to see a doctor. They may need to, maybe they would benefit from seeing someone who does acupuncture or a chiropractor or whatever it might be to help this person heal. Or maybe see someone who does more things on aromatherapy or using herbs and medicines like that. And also emotionally, how can they heal emotionally? They may want to see a therapist, sure, but also there's ways of healing by seeing traditional healers as well as the spiritual part, right? When we look at mental, what does that mean? I talk about things like if you have it in your mind because you've heard this over and over that you know why domestic violence happens, get some education about it, talk to other people who've experienced domestic violence, attend a support group. Well, you'll hear really why domestic violence happens. It happens because of that externally imposed problem, right? The societal messages. It happens because someone chose to be violent, not because there's something you did, right? That's going to start to heal that person in their mental thinking about what happened to them, right? So I always encourage people to look at all the resources that you have access to. What doesn't exist in your community? Where you have to rely on those services in the outside of your community. Okay, next slide. We also have to believe that, given that domestic violence is such a huge problem, we can also assume that, for a battered woman that has children, it's going to impact them as well. And this just speaks to how they can be impacted by witnessing that violence. It can impact them academically. It can, if they go to bed, they hear their father abusing their mother, they hear those sounds, it may impact their sleep patterns, their ability to get a good night's sleep, which may affect them the next day in school. It may affect them physically, where they may not want to eat or they may overeat. All of these different ways that it can impact children who witness the violence. It can have that kind of short-term impact, but it also can have long-term impact on children. So again, it's really important to look at protecting children, create some protocols as far as, what do children need. And oftentimes what ends up happening is children will be removed from the mom, the non-offending parent, for what they call unable to protect, or I think it's called unable to protect. There's another term for it. Oh. And it's kind of like then the mother and the children both get punished for something that they've not chosen to do. It's the batterer who has chosen to abuse the mother in that situation, and the children have been impacted. And yet, because, oftentimes battered women will return to their abusive situations because of economic reasons, because she still loves him, because she feels like she could make a difference. She's punished for that, and also the children, by removing the children and placing them in foster homes and so forth. So next slide. And these are just a few effects that domestic violence may have on children. I've already mentioned some, the academic impact. I'm not going to read these to you, just have them provide them for you. I had a project. It was called the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on American Indian Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence, and I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. Ending Violence So Children Can Thrive. It was an amazing couple of years spent on developing that study. Had a lot of excellent testimony from people who witnessed violence as children, who were exposed and victimized by violence as children. Next slide. And often we hear, if she doesn't like it, then why didn't she just leave, right? Lots of reasons why women stay. And but I think, the greater question is, why do batterers batter? Next slide. I've already mentioned that why victims may return to the perpetrator or refuse to leave the relationship, to hold a family together, to believe that children should have a father and a mother or both parents. Um, she still loves him. The victim still loves the batterer. Feels ashamed, feels to blame because that's what the perpetrator said. Especially for sex trafficking victims. I should have known better. I thought I could get out of this after one time, and here I am. I can't. I'm scared to leave. I don't want to go home because I will be ostracized. I'll be looked on as, as a prostitute. And there also may be that low self-esteem, believing that I don't deserve better. He's told me that no one else is going to want me after this. Feel that, that the victim's the only one that can save the perpetrator. If I just love him enough, if I just do enough for him, have his children, he'll change. Also the financial aspect, not being able to afford having developing another household for herself and her children. Fear of losing the children, I've said that numerous times, may have cultural values that discourage disclosure of domestic violence and also sexual abuse. It's still difficult, I think, for a lot of Native people, Native women, to talk about sexual abuse, especially to people who, in cross-gender situations. Lots of reasons. We could fill up several pages of why, uh, victims return to the perpetrator. The perpetrator saying, "I'll never do that again. I'm sorry." And yet, as we see that there's a high incidence of repeated abuse. Next slide. What I want to take you through is just a little journey through the lives of battered women in particular. I keep referring to victims as women, as you probably have heard. It's not to say that men aren't victims of domestic violence. They can be, and they are. The statistics say it's much more likely that it'll be a woman. So just out of convenience, I use the female gender. Um, but I want to take you through these slides pretty quickly. We could do entire training on even just on one slide and what the protocols consist of within each of these options that are provided. As advocates, we provide options for victims that we work with. We don't say this is what you have to do. This is an option you have available to you. At any point, you can choose to say, no, I don't want that option, right? I don't want to do that. I don't want to pursue that. There's also that possibility that that option, that resource doesn't exist, right, in a tribal community in California, for example. So I want to take you quickly through these slides. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because it would just take too long. But I just do it just really mainly for visual purposes and to put a picture together for you. Okay. The other thing I also encourage advocates, so that you all know, this is, the work of advocates it goes beyond hand-holding, right? We're there to support them, absolutely. We want to be their main support. We're in their corner, we believe them, we provide the validation. But the one thing I always tell advocates is know your resources. Know them well. Know the people who work in those programs, those agencies, those departments. Know them, on a first name basis. Get to know them, have coffee with them. Know their protocol, know their policies. That way, you're going to be able to inform that victim of who they're going to be coming in contact with. Our power just flashed off and on, and the skies are very dark outside. So if I go away, you'll know why. Um, so I encourage advocates to really do their homework when they're going to be working with victims directly and providing advocacy. So I wanted to just say that also. Next slide. So this is the when a 911 call is made by a victim to report domestic violence, right? Then the law enforcement, the appropriate law enforcement will uh, respond. This is challenging for a lot of Native victims of domestic violence in tribal communities. And like I said before, there's a lot of tribal communities in California that are very remote, very isolated, right? And they have to rely on law enforcement that aren't right there, right within their own community, right? They may have to travel those little mountainous roads, and that can be really challenging. The response time might be really delayed. It may be half an hour. A lot can happen in a half an hour, right? More violence can happen. Um, so just keep that in mind as well as far as what's challenging. And it's all of these reasons why victims may not want to report because of these situations. If I call 911, they're not going to get here right away. And what can happen in the meantime? So they won't even call, right? They'll just try to stay in the situation and make the best of it. But this takes us through that process of what happens. There could be an arrest, there's an investigation, there's an arrest or no arrest, and um, hopefully, at the first point of contact, an advocate can be called, right? An advocate can be called, sometimes maybe to the scene or maybe meet the victim at the hospital, however that can work. And then from there, an advocate can continue to work with the victim. And then it takes you through the whole arraignments, where a no contact order can be made, and all the pre-trial, the trial, sentencing, monitoring, and probation. Okay. Through all of this whole process, victims should be kept informed of where the process is at. That doesn't always happen either. Someone drops the ball and doesn't inform the victim. So that's that. Okay, next slide. This one is the shelter. If there is a shelter in the community, victims have the option to seek shelter. When that person enters the shelter, there's a process that's involved. There's intake. The advocate doing the intake will inform the victim of what all is available there as far as services. There might be a child advocate there who can work with the kids. They'll help her get the kids in school. They'll help her retrieve her belongings from home. They'll find out if she wants to seek a protection order. They'll share information about house rules and policies, which include her attending house meetings, signing up for house chores, curfew times, the care of her children, and so forth. And all the other outside services that might be available to her. They'll inform her of those, maybe give her brochures about the outside services that are available. Okay, so this all can happen if there is a shelter, right? And if there is, chances are it's not going to be tribally based, where the services are going to be culturally appropriate for that victim. That's the ideal situation, and there are not many in across the country as far as Native tribally based shelters. But if there is luck, if the victim is fortunate enough to have one, then that's great. Okay, next slide. So the next is child protection. If she has a case, it may be reopened, or maybe she is already involved in a child protection case. Maybe her kids are in placement. So this is a whole nother system that this victim has to be working with in order to not lose her children, or in order to get her children back from child protection. The term that I was looking for was failure to protect, where battered women, their children are taken because she returns to the batterer. And again, they witness that violence and they take the children because the woman returned. That's something that really should not happen. Rather, the victim of the domestic violence should be empowered, should be protected along with her children rather than taking the children. There's other nuances, of course, that happens where maybe that removal is warranted. If there's drug use, drug trafficking, if there's other things, abuse by the mother to the children, absolutely, that there's some situations, but in a broader picture, it really, some of those things weren't in place when women have lost their children. Once they lose their children, it's so difficult to get them back, especially if the batterer controls the finances, if they have connections with tribal leadership, with people who work in child protective services, where the woman, the battered woman, it doesn't have legal representation. It makes it really challenging for her to get her children back out of that system. So again, often Native battered women are so in need of civil representation, civil attorneys. So if you know of any good help out there, definitely, that's in need. Next slide. This is housing. When a law enforcement is called repeatedly to a certain location, after a while, especially if it's put the name of the house is in her name, she may get evicted from her house. If the batterer has a close relative who works in tribal housing, she may lose her house. So there's all these different circumstances, and she may be having to deal again with that civil process of eviction, and also be in need of looking for alternative housing. And heaven forbid that she would have to go to a homeless shelter, because they're just not amenable to helping victims of domestic violence or sexual assault or trafficking, because there's a lot of perpetrators that also are sheltered in homeless shelters. So that, again, this is a whole nother system that she has to work with. Next slide. Protection orders. You all are probably familiar with protection orders, and they're a way for this person to obtain some additional protection. Although we still hear a lot of battered women saying it's just a piece of paper, it's not going to stop him. And also the challenge of getting protection orders enforced when it was, she's in a tribal community, travels to a non-tribal community outside, and it's not enforced because it doesn't meet all the requirements. And that becomes really challenging for her. So that's, it's a whole nother system that she has to work with the courts, and the likelihood that she has to see him again and all of that. Next slide. Child custody. And I already kind of went through this. She loses her children, or she, is involved in a legal separation or wants to get a legal separation or divorce. She may need access to a civil attorney. If he's controlled all the finances, chances are she can't afford much, if any at all. But she wants to obtain or retain custody of her children. And again, a whole nother process that she has to contend with and deal with, of seeking that legal option. Okay, next slide. So when we put this all together, all of these options she has available to her, what's your thoughts? Just want to get some feedback. What's your thoughts when you see this slide? You could put your comments in chat if you would, please. Give you a couple minutes, running out of time. Also, when we toss in the fact that I said earlier, leaving could be volatile for a battered woman as the batter is losing control. So there's also that threat along with having to deal with all of this, all of these options. Any comments?
Bonnie, a couple came in the question box. Overwhelming and overwhelming to an already emotionally overwhelming situation.
Yes, exactly. So when we talk about why don't battered women leave, I always encourage people to think about this slide. What we're thinking, it's just easy to leave a situation like that when no, it's not always that easy. Especially when we look at are all these resources readily available to a battered woman in a community in California? No, they're not. They're not always easily accessible to battered women in those little remote villages, rancherias. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Next slide. So we say that, complex service needs of battered women. Number one is safety, always safety. That's the first question. As we have contact with battered women, are you safe? Where is your perpetrator? And start looking at what will it take to help you be safe. And I say that that should extend through the whole process, all of these options that we just showed you, that question of safe. Are you safe here? If you're seeking a protection order, you're going to the courthouse, are you safe there? What's the chances that he'll show up there? If you seek medical attention, we didn't even put that on the screen. That's a whole nother system that a rape victim would have to deal with, right? Going into the emergency room, are you going to know people there? Are they going to tell the perpetrator that you're there to seek medical attention? Because tribal communities are small, where privacy, confidentiality challenges exist. All the fear of a victim losing her children to the batter because he might abduct the children. All of these make these service needs and challenges even more so for a lot of victims. And I already said victims often have to travel great distances from remote areas in California. Some tribes don't have well-established courts to address these crimes. Like I said, tribes are working diligently on improving their responses. They're pulling together multidisciplinary teams. They're also, updating and revising their tribal codes. Some are just now creating domestic violence codes, but there's a lot of work being done by tribes. Okay, next slide. Additional challenges, we have a lot of Native people living in urban areas in California, and also those that are pretty transient. They move in and out, especially for sex trafficking victims, right? So it's really, really important to keep, be aware of that as well. Challenges having protection orders enforced, the PL 280 challenges that I mentioned also earlier, lack of formalized agreements, which also is part of being from a PL 280 state. There's not always those formal agreements between jurisdictions because we have, the sovereign tribal nations that's located within another sovereign, and oftentimes, others don't recognize that tribes are sovereign. And it's important to work with tribes. I was working with a little community or a tribe in California, Southern California, near San Diego, and San Diego had a multidisciplinary team, and they were really supposed to be doing outreach to the local tribe, right? And they weren't. So the tribe there decided to start their own SART, their own sexual assault response team. And they reached out to people like the San Diego County sheriffs and so forth. And they said, well, we're already on an MDT. You know, we just don't have the manpower to sit on 2 MDTs. Well, it's like, yes, but you also respond to these crimes, just like Border Patrol. Border Patrol were more than happy to sit on that tribe's MDT. So we had to, you know, I encouraged them to invite the sheriffs to their meetings that were being held in the community, in the MDT in the community. So they did. And actually the main sheriff there came, and we explained to him why it was important, because they considered a duplication of efforts to have, you know, their own SART in San Diego County, which is one of the biggest SARTs probably in the country, and why they would duplicate efforts by having one of their sheriffs sit on, or, you know, on the tribe SART. And once he came out and saw the community, what the community's doing, their needs, the needs of the victims there, he really got it. So they started sending sheriffs to the SART meetings there in that community. So one example of the challenges that tribes that are in PL 280 states encounter. Under-resourced law enforcement departments and staff shortages. I talked about that. We have a reservation. On one end of the reservation, there could be a critical car crash, for example. On the other end, there could be this domestic violence incident where cops have been called numerous times, and they're going to downgrade it and say, well, but you know, they're just squabbling again. They'll be fine. We'll go, you know, report to the scene of this accident. In the meantime, this battered woman could be killed, right? So it really creates, again, those additional challenges on getting a shorter response time for domestic violence. And I already talked about the other limited access to attorneys to advocate and represent Native victims. It's a need. It's a huge need. Next slide. And I've already talked about a lot of this, victim safety and services, the importance of providing front-loaded assistance, including court accompaniment, crisis intervention. Not every community has advocates, which is another huge challenge. I can't express the importance of victims having advocates as soon as possible. Creating that coordinated community response, efficient case processing, you know, timely and effective management of DV caseloads by trained staff. I think it's really also very important having, you know, even in terms of how cases get calendared, that they should be seen as being really important and being kind of seen as a priority as far as a domestic violence docket, because time is really of the essence for a lot of victims. Informed judicial decision-making, creation of a judiciary who are knowledgeable of the dynamics of domestic violence and have access to accurate, immediate case information where appropriate. Again, just moving things in a timely, efficient manner, and being handled by people who have good training. Offender accountability, holding perpetrators accountable, working closely with probation and so forth to maintain that level of accountability is really important. And where everyone is informing each other, I think, is also so that there aren't those cracks in the system. Okay, next slide. Challenge of prosecuting crimes, all based on all of these factors that I've mentioned already. Lack of collaboration between jurisdictions, intergovernment cooperation, lack of formalized agreements, sharing of information databases, making sure that tribes have access to where some of this information is stored and kept in those databases. Sometimes they don't have the ability to access them. They haven't been given the permission to access them, maybe not have the technology to access them. So again, resources are growing, but they need to have access to those databases. Understanding about each other's protocols and also cultural values. So sharing information, doing cross-discipline, cross-jurisdictional training, I think is really important as well. Next slide. Okay, I've already talked a lot about a lot of the intersections of physical assault, sexual assault, stalking, abduction, false imprisonment. Just encourage investigators to look at all of these crimes, that there's a strong possibility that that these crimes all may be occurring, particularly like in sex trafficking. So not to miss the opportunity to look at them and to be able to charge them accordingly. Because if you can't get a conviction on one, maybe we could get one on one of these other crimes. Okay. I've already talked a lot about the importance of engaging advocates early on if possible, because they really do provide a lot of support for victims. And and especially for, I say, what's the you know the benefits of all of these responders being a part of an MDT is being able to, it helps you make your job easier, right? If you're a prosecutor, to have access to an advocate, to be able to communicate with an advocate. If you need additional information on making a case stronger, an advocate can help you do that, can work with the victim to say, who else witnessed this crime? Where can we find that person? Where do they hang out at? Oh yeah, they hang out at so-and-so's house. Those are kind of inside information that I think can be really helpful in creating stronger cases, and just being able to have that advocate working with that victim, I think. Also protecting victim information, protecting the victim's right to confidentiality and privacy. And those can be challenging in small communities, but advocates are there to sort of be a watchdog over that, to make sure that victim, their rights are not violated, their right to confidentiality. Okay, I think I've said all these things before already. When working with tribal representatives, so important to understand and respect tribal sovereignty. And even myself, when I go into a tribal land, I ask permission for certain things. I say, thank you for allowing me to be here to share information with you. I'm not from here, but thank you for allowing me to be here. Sharing resources, always, tribes are always open to that. Because again, not all tribes have all the resources. Even if they have tribal gaming and revenue from that, doesn't mean they have all the resources that they need. Honest, open communication, listen and learn, being able to ask what you don't know, I think is really important. They'll gain the respect of tribal members by doing that. Honor their tribal history and traditions. Do your own homework about a tribe that you might be working with and their history, because there's a lot of tribes that are proud that they survived a lot of the cultural oppression. And speak to tribal leaders. Ask who the tribal leaders are. Who should I be talking to? Who should I be asking? Those are all important questions to ask, and really to not make assumptions about any one tribe. Tribes, even as small as some tribes are, they're making great gains. They're doing a lot of good work in their community with very little resources. So it's important for us not to make those assumptions. Okay. Just a couple of resources. There's some good work being done by Sovereign Bodies Institute. They have a website, sovereignbodies.org. Also, the Strong Heart Native Women's Coalition are doing excellent work with direct service providers, advocacy programs in California. So I ask you to look them up as well. They're called strongheartednativewomen.org. Next slide. These are websites that we've developed. I was personally involved in developing the tribaltrafficking.org website. It has a lot of really good resources on trafficking as it's happening in tribal communities all over. Okay. Any questions, comments? This is my contact information. Email is the best way. Comments, questions, got a couple of minutes. Yay, it's not dark out anymore. That was scary. Lights flashed.
Bonnie, there is one question. Is domestic violence generational?
I would say yes, absolutely, yes. You know, children learn violence. Absolutely. Children learn violence. It doesn't just fall from the sky, right? If they've seen it happen in their families, in the kinship system, I talk about our families being fairly large. You know, we have what in the mainstream called godparents. We have extended family who are we have many dads, we have many moms, we have many grandparents. So the chances are that we witnessed it in one of those situations are pretty great. So yes, I would say it's generational. But not all families does it exist either. I say people learn violence and we can also unlearn violence. And that's where batterer re-education programs come in, where I've seen men who, you know, you could see the light bulb going off that have learned that this is something I've learned to do that I have found that it's acceptable, what we call in mainstream male privilege, and it can be unlearned. Abby, do you want to give them information about the next in the series if there's no other questions? And I just want to say thank you for joining us. I hope I've provided some helpful, useful information for you. And if you have any other questions, you can certainly feel free to email me as well.
Yes, the next webinar is same platform, same registration link. It will be Thursday, September 2nd, same time, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time.
Okay, thank you all.